You know how I can tell that I fell in love with this story? It's because every time I see this moment, I tear up a little, and to be frank, I think that if you've played it, you do also. Before I say anything, let me put in the preliminary warning as always. I will be spoiling everything about the House of Fata Morgana in this one, so if you are at all curious about the story in any way, have heard all the good things about it, or seen its incredibly high rating on VNDB, may I suggest taking a look at this non-spoiler overview I've already done instead to learn more about it. Link at the top right. In fact, I'm gonna go one step further and recommend that you go play it before going any further, because it is incredibly well written and I believe you'll get more from experiencing it yourself than me spoiling the heck out of it here. It's not the most epic story I've ever read. In fact, the scale of the story is actually fairly small, but it has one of the biggest hearts I've ever seen. It's a story about love that only existed for a month, but lasted an eternity until the end. Even if you decide not to play it and just want to hear me talk about it, I hope I can convey at least a little bit of why I found it so beautiful. Anywho, at this point, I assume anyone that is sticking around has already played the game and are curious as to my opinions about the story, or they just want to hear me blab about a visual novel they never plan on playing, which, either way, welcome. Before going any further, I'll give a basic rundown as always so we can be on the same page. The House in Fata Morgana tells a tale of a mansion up in the middle of nowhere. Our main character arrives at the mansion and is quickly informed by a woman who only refers to herself as the maid, that they are the master of the mansion. Unfortunately, as we don't seem to remember anything, the maid decides to guide us through this decrepit, lifeless manor and explore the masters of previous generations, of inhabitants who have all fallen to some sort of tragedy that has left the mansion at the state it currently is. Perhaps by going through their memories, we can find hints as to our own. Throughout each one of the 3 generations, the white-haired lady and the maid herself all remain constant, miraculously appearing across every generation. At the end of all these stories, what is the true tale about the House of Fata Morgana? Who is this mysterious witch? Who is this maid? Who is this white-haired girl? And who is this supposed master who has finally arrived at the end of time? No matter what happens though, we must not let go of the maid's hand. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the House of Fata Morgana is that I truly believe on an emotional level about the undying love between the main characters. But I suppose I am getting ahead of myself. For those who have not played the game yet, this is a nice scene, yeah, but the weight of every single word and how much it means for both of the main characters is not apparent without everything that has happened beforehand. So I figured the best way to go through this story would be the exact same way as any player did, from the beginning all the way till the end. I'll share my thoughts on each individual tale and what they contribute to the overall narrative with hindsight in mind. There are a total of 8 doors we must go through, and I hope by the end I can impress on you why this nice scene is something worth crying over. The first door starts out in the year 1603, involving the story of the Rose siblings, Mel Rose, a young noble, and Nellie Rose, his little sister. Out of the first 4 stories, it is easily the brightest one and honestly probably the weakest one from a narrative standpoint. It's a basic story where Nellie is infatuated with her big brother Mel to an obvious romantic degree, something which is wrong because they are blood siblings. Things seem alright until a white-haired lady comes into the mansion as a servant and Mel becomes infatuated with her. Just by the fact that you know every single story coming up will ultimately end in a tragedy, it's super easy to deduce what exactly is going to happen here. It's pretty clear that Nellie's love for her brother is not going to pan out very well, especially for whichever girl ends up catching his eye. And when the white-haired girl does just that, well, Nellie's going to have some words with her, shall we say. To the surprise of no one, Nellie goes batshit crazy, ripping off the maid's white hair and kicking her out of the house, then trying to bone her brother without consent. What is kind of surprising, however, is just how monumentally messed up the entire situation becomes, with the reveal that the white-haired girl is actually half-siblings with the Rhodes family, born out of an affair with a painter who is the white-haired girl's dad. Nellie finds this out when she comes across a painting of their family, except the blonde-haired girl in question wasn't her, but rather of their unborn child that he prayed would have the same color. What tips Nellie over isn't the fact that her brother is romantically interested in another girl, or ignoring her once he started seeing someone else, but rather that the girl he's after is also related by blood to them, which is the entire reason that everyone has told her in the first place that their relationship is wrong. This first story does a good job setting up many of the initial mysteries for the player. Our goal as a new master of the mansion isn't finding out what ultimately happens to Mel and Nellie, but rather how their situation relates to ours. We learn of the mysterious white-haired girl who comes seemingly out of nowhere, of the maid who also miraculously exists in this era. What I think this first story does amazingly well is the characterization of Mel. At first he seems like the perfect, kind prince that Nellie always calls him out to be. Everyone has high expectations of him and is smart, and he's even kind to his servants. Underneath this perfect veneer, however, lies an aimless young man who has no idea who he really even is. While on one hand, you can view the resulting tragedy as something that happened to a young boy who didn't know what was going on, from another point of view, it's about an idiotic guy who was too afraid to do anything. Mel obviously knew his sister was unnaturally fascinated with him from the very beginning, but he never confronted the problem. Instead, all he did was bask in the unconditional adoration from Nellie, then tossed it aside the minute it became more of an issue, and he found someone else who would give him the same sort of love. Even by the end, when he laments about how did everything go so wrong, he doesn't really recognize how everything that happened is a result of what he chose to do or not to do, instead shifting the blame onto someone else. The most overt thing about Mel's utter ineptitude is when he pushes away the white-haired girl after Nellie rips off her hair and he is unable to recognize her. It shows that Mel's kindness was kind of self-serving. It was given when he thought he had something to gain, and when he didn't, he couldn't even be bothered. Taking place in the year 1707, the second door acts as a foil of sorts to the first door, following the story of Bestia. Unlike the bright, saccharine atmosphere of the last era, now we have what I can only describe as macabre. Gone are the bright, fluffy atmosphere of the last mansion and replaced with one that is desolate and blood-soaked. Instead of a prince, now we have a crazed, inhuman beast playing the central role. The maid this time around is also much more involved, as she is the one who actively welcomes the beast and teaches them how to become more human. Throughout the beginning, we learn in bits and pieces about Bestia himself, how he woke up in the middle of nowhere and was persecuted by villagers. Even when he tried to beg for food, he was constantly attacked, until he finally started retaliating in the most brutal way possible. Although at first it seems like Bestia is slowly becoming more human, an encounter with a merchant showing a knife quickly turns sour as Bestia loses control after being reminded of his persecution. After murdering the merchant, Bestia throws that becoming human plan down the drain as he proceeds to entrap and murder countless visitors. Meanwhile, in a completely separate location, we are introduced to Pauline, a young woman who has fallen in love with a merchant from a foreign land. We witness their interactions as they grow closer together until one day the merchant goes missing, and Pauline decides to set out to find him. The white-haired girl also makes a return. As for whether it is the same girl or not, the maid seems to confirm these suspicions, although she is blind this time around and is unable to recognize her. While seeming to be just another victim, Bestia eventually becomes attached to her, finding a reason to try and be human once more. What the Bestia chapter excels in is highlighting the inner struggle of the main character. While Mel was kind of an idiot who was more in love with the idea of being in love than anything, Bestia's struggle feels a lot more nuanced. He is torn between wanting to be human, but being afraid of it at the same time. The reason why Bestia could justify all of his previous actions, his insane bloodlust, and fascination with murder, was because he was a beast, and he was different from the other villagers. He was never meant to be accepted by others in the first place. Although the white-haired girl brings back his desire to be human as she constantly tries to tell him that he is just as human as everyone else, Bestia never truly accepts this a fact, reasoning it away as that she is blind and that if she could see what he actually looks like, she would think he was a beast too. To accept that he is also human like anyone else would be to realize that he has no justification for all his murderous impulses and insane desires. This refusal to see that very fact is what ultimately leads to the tragedy of the era. While Bestia is trying to live a quiet life with the white-haired girl, he is then visited by, surprisingly, another being like himself. Believing that this being will seek to kill the white-haired girl, he brutally kills it first before it can get dumb. Swapping back to Pauline, we see that she comes across a remote fishing village that seems to really hate outsiders. There she befriends a village boy, and soon after learns about the beast at the top of the mansion. Finding out that the merchant went missing, she convinces the boy to lead her there, and that's where the reveal happens, that the merchant that went missing is Bestia himself, and the fact that he was unable to see himself as anything but a beast means that he could only perceive Pauline, who was similar to him, as a beast as well. This then ends with the boy seeking revenge, gathering a group of villagers who brutalize the white-haired woman. Bestia, seeing his one tether that allowed him to stay human gone, snaps and fully turns into the beast, murdering everyone and ending the era. Aside from having a better build-up to the reveal, one of the most important things that the second door conveys is the idea of perception. How, although everyone can view the same action, not everyone can understand all the motivations and hidden thoughts of those involved. Granted, I think this one is a lot more on the nose considering that it's the big twist of the door, and the game practically spells it out to you in huge glowing letters, but it does a good job of putting that concept into the player's mind for the rest of the game, as this idea of perception will be pivotal to every subsequent story. Door 3 begins in the year 1869, after the Industrial Revolution, where our main character is an up-and-coming businessman, Jacopo, whose pursuit of wealth and power seems to have led him to also completely neglect his wife, the white-haired lady. Luckily, the white-haired lady has a friend she can confide in, one of the servants, Maria. If the main theme of Door 2 was perception, then the main theme of Door 3 is faith. Not faith in a higher being, but rather faith in others and faith in oneself. Granted, it's not as if this theme wasn't present in the previous eras, but this is the one that shows it front and center. Our protagonist of the era, Jacopo, suffers from a severe lack of trust in anybody, probably due to his upbringing as a son of a mob family, where he was constantly taught about trusting family, even while every moment is spent backstabbing that very same family to get to a higher position. Half the plot here is dedicated towards showing the white-haired girl's ongoing deteriorating relationship with Jacopo, where we see her side of things, how everything she does leads to making him angry at her for whatever reason, and her telling Maria how Jacopo used to be someone kind of the past. This relationship worsens all the way to the point where Jacopo ends up locking the white-haired girl in a shack for months on end, convinced that somehow she's going out and cheating on him with somebody. The other half of the plot is revealed when we see Maria and Jacopo confiding in each other, where we learn of how they are childhood friends and that she's the only one he trusts, which immediately raises the red flag of, oh okay, Maria is the one messing with the two, which was already the most logical answer, as they were the only three important characters in the entire chapter. As you entirely expect from what I just said, that is indeed exactly what has happened. Once we shift viewpoints from Jacopo to Maria, we clearly see what's exactly been going on. All of those love letters that the white-haired girl sent to Jacopo while she was locked up, given to Maria, who told Jacopo it was towards a secret lover rather than him. This all culminates in Jacopo waiting until it's too late to hear from the white-haired girl herself, and Maria attempted to kill him only for him to get her first. I think out of the three routes, this is probably the one that drags the most. While it definitely isn't the worst story out of the three, as Mel's story is kinda boring to be frank and easily takes that spot, Mel's has the luxury of being the first one and acting as an introduction. By the third tale, I think it's kind of obvious how all these plots are going to unfold, and it becomes less of a matter of figuring out how the story is going to end, but rather seeing how each story portrays the tale. You can see how little faith Jacopo has in the white-haired lady through the letters. Maria had mentioned they were from a secret lover, but every moment described in the letter was stuff they had actually done together. The fact that he couldn't tell shows that he really thought she was someone who could easily betray him like the others in his life. It also shows how easy it is to misunderstand a situation simply by coming in with biased assumptions. If the first three tales were the introduction to the House of Fata Morgana, then this fourth tale is a gateway into the true tale, sort of. Before we can get started with that though, we have the intermission period where we get to meet the three shadows of the main characters we just met. The prince, the beast, and the businessman. We also get to talk with the painting, someone who seems to know a bit more about the secret behind everything, and one who urges us to talk to the maid once we realized who we truly are. Once we are done with interacting with everybody else, we can then reconvene with the maid who shows us to the fourth and final door, taking place in the year 1099. A story that the maid herself states is a tragic love story. For this tale, we play as the white-haired girl once more as she comes across Maiko, a pale social recluse who lives in a deserted mansion. So begins their cohabitation, one who self-proclaims himself as a witch, while the other on the run as she is proclaimed by others as a witch. While at first their interactions are rare, over time they slowly get to know each other. We learn of the girl's name, Giselle. We learn that Michael's family delivers food to him once a month, but they never interact with him as he is beset by some unknown curse that gives him the touch of death. We also get to learn more about the witch and her curse, something which Michael believes he has inherited, considering his own curse. Their time together finally ends when the bandit tries to rob the house. While Heroine tries to resist, Michael is forced to drain touch and nearly kill the bandit as he escapes with his life. Unfortunately, as a bit of his blood fell into Giselle during the scuffle, she slowly starts to die. To make matters worse, the villagers, learning of his existence as a witch from the bandit, come together to burn him. Everything ends at the same watchtower. Knowing their end, they embrace one last time as the white-haired girl falls limp. Seeking to protect at least her body from being desecrated, Michael throws himself at the ensuing horde as his blood sprays all over the villagers, killing everybody. Moments later, the white-haired girl wakes up only to see Michael and everybody else dead. Distraught at being the only one alive, the witch appears, granting the girl the wish to reunite with her beloved at the cost of becoming the eternal master of the mansion, forced to fail time and time again. The maid proclaims herself as the witch, as she reveals our main character to be the white-haired girl who failed to save Michael centuries ago. The maid says that all she wants for us is to become her eternal master and live out our days with her, even if we are unable to find Michael ever again. As the end to the introduction, this fourth door kinda blends together all of the three previous tales into a single story in its execution and ultimate reveal. This fourth door brings together many of the same concepts we've seen again and again. The faulty narration and perspective, like in the second door with the Beast tale, the idealization of these characters from the Prince tale with the first door, and the blind faith present with Jacopo in the third door. If it wasn't obvious from what I labeled the chapter down below, this entire story is a fabrication done by the maid. From the very beginning, we were told that it was easy to handle these tragedies because they were happening to others, and the secrets that were revealed were our own, we'd break down. This central theme is reintroduced here, and it's only the first of many times it will do so. As a voice, which we can presume to be the witch, berates us for our choice, we break free. As we realize that unlike what the maid suggests, we are not the white-haired girl, rather, this heroine we were looking at in the fourth door has black hair, like the maid who's been guiding us this entire time. Flipping the story on its head, we are the one who Giselle has been waiting for, someone which she denies wholeheartedly, having forgotten it herself over the centuries she's been locked up in the house. On a side note, while our main character proclaims everything just stated as some story without a scrap of humanity, that isn't entirely true. While much of what is revealed in this tale is a delusion created by the maid Giselle or even by the witch Morgana, it also has a truth interwoven into much of it as well, an idea which will become incredibly important for the rest of the game. Now that we realize who we truly are as Michael, we can now access the fifth door, only openable with Giselle, as we find out what really happened. Once again, at the mansion, we meet our main character Michael, who immediately proclaims himself as a witch, even though the actual witch of legend is Morgana. Giselle's response, unlike the reverence shown in the previous tale, is to laugh in Michael's face, thinking it's a joke. In hindsight, I think this chapter forms the cornerstone of the House of Fata Morgana. By acting as the previous tale, but with all the humanity of the two main characters reinserted back into it, we are led to believe that this current story is the truth. And the true genius of the story lies in the fact that, while everything that happens in this chapter is indeed real, it isn't the whole truth. It's hard to tell because during this tale, we do switch between both perspectives. We see both Michael writing a letter to his parents, and Giselle remembering the trauma that occurred between her and Michael's dad. The keen eye might realize, however, that while we do get into the viewpoints of both characters, we predominantly get more scenes regarding Giselle's side than Michael's. By having it be something like 70-30, it's easy to miss this discrepancy, and that right there is crucial to the central theme of the story. The reason why this doesn't feel unnatural is mostly due to how it's set up. At this point, we are trying to get Giselle to remember her past self, while Michael is trying to remember what happened. Michael himself also has traits pretty similar to the previous three protagonists as well. The most obvious is Beast, as Michael has been banished from his family due to his features, namely his albinism. There is more, but not something we can get into yet. He also has a noble upbringing of Mel, as the Bollinger house is clearly quite powerful, as that is why Michael is so distrustful of Giselle, seeing her as a spy that is out to get some dirt about the black mark of the family. On Jacopo's side, due to his upbringing of which we haven't fully seen yet, he does have also a strong distrust of others. Giselle herself is quite different from our previous white-haired heroine. She's bright, cheerful, energetic, strong-willed. At the same time, however, it's easy to see that a lot of this energy and bluster, while not contrary to who she is, also acts as a shield to much of what has happened to her before her meeting with Maiko. Their personalities in essence couldn't be more different, but what connects them more than anything is not just pain, but rather loneliness. While in the fairy tale, all their interactions serve to strengthen their bond, here it just makes it worse. We get the scene of them talking over book, except this time it goes nowhere, and a once a month package arrives, except this time a painting is brought along, which leads Maiko to losing his temper, something which subsequently almost pushes Giselle over the edge, as all of her efforts to get closer to him have been entirely for naught. Their innate difference of noble and servant is what forces Maiko to see her as someone who would never understand him, and vice versa. When he attempts to force her to confess what happened, it leads to an altercation as Maiko relieves some trauma of being called an abomination, and Giselle reacting violently when he puts his hand on her. This suspicion continues as Maiko writes a letter to his mother, where we learn that even here he is known to be cursed. When Giselle comes across the painting of the white-haired girl ripped up, that's when Maiko reveals everything that he's discovered about Giselle. Giselle attempts to tell the truth but is unable to talk as Maiko continues to spill more secrets, while threatening her with a blade. Maiko's father, Antonin Bollinger, was having an affair with Giselle by forcing her to serve him, and her fear of knives came about because aside from being a general scumbag, Antonin also seemed to have a sick fascination with carving words into her skin like harlot. Once his wife found out, she was forced to leave after taking all the blame for seducing him. After reliving this trauma, Giselle escapes as she collapses in the middle of nowhere. At this point, we hit a break in the story where Giselle is found by a nice young man, Amity, as he welcomes her into the small village he lives in. Nothing lasts forever though, as a recent tax increase leads to the villagers turning on each other, with their hatred focusing on Giselle as an outsider. Amity himself accuses her as he's bitter from her marriage refusal. While tortured for a crime she didn't commit, Giselle sells out Maiko, telling villagers that they can raid the mansion as there is no witch, just a lonely noble boy in the hopes of avoiding further pain. This leads to a big confrontation as while the villagers are attempting to break into his house, Maiko reveals himself, proclaiming his pale skin and white hair as evidence of him being a witch, as he fools the villagers into believing that he can curse them for all of eternity if they don't leave him alone. With them gone, Maiko confronts Giselle, angry at her for leading a mob into his doorsteps. Giselle, on the other hand, having been ignored and exploited by literally everyone in her entire life, cracks and yells at Maiko to end her miserable life. This finally catches his attention as Giselle is able to convey her side of the story for the first time. Maiko realizes what an asshat he's been, that everything presumed to be suspicious behavior came because of her trauma caused by his father. And Giselle in turn is able to learn about Maiko, that he isn't cursed but rather was casted aside by his family due to his white hair, red eyes, and sensitivity to light. Thanks to it being the Middle Ages though, this was thought to be a representative of devil magic. With the two revealing their secrets, they were able to start living together for real. These next set of scenes are really nice. We get to watch two people who have been repeatedly hurt by the world thankfully achieve some measure of solace. While nothing they do is spectacular by any means, stuff like arm wrestling, cooking, drawing, that normalcy is so special because up until now, that sort of life was like a miracle to them. This culminates in love growing between them, something which is hard for both of them, for Giselle as she already has an aversion to men thanks to what Antonin did, and Maiko who has plenty of his own demons to conquer as well, but somehow both are able to push past their respective issues and confess their love. We dive straight into the finale with Maiko's dad dying out of nowhere. His banishment is now over and he can return back to the house. This doesn't end well though, as a group of knights come to burn the witch. On their retreat, Giselle apologizes that she believes they came due to her confrontation with the villagers. However, Maiko takes the blame for this, saying it is due to the witch's curse. This ends at the watchtower once more as Maiko pushes Giselle inside and the door mysteriously locks. Knights barge in, proclaiming Maiko to be a heretic, a witch to be burned and hanged. The knights stab Maiko to death as they take him away. Giselle clings to blood-stained clothes as we fade to black. Our sixth story begins right where our last one left off, with Giselle in shambles after Maiko's death. At this point, the witch Morgana reaches out to Giselle, whereupon she finds out that Maiko wasn't insane. The witch was real and has been speaking to him all this time. She's the one who protected the door from the knights and the one that kept her alive. The two agree to a deal. Giselle stays with Morgana and welcomes visitors to the mansion, the heinous sinners as she calls them, and she gets a chance to reunite with Michael, who will be reborn. Giselle takes the deal and becomes the maid, an eternal being stuck in a dismal rundown version of their house. Decades pass as absolutely nothing happens. No life, no brightness, with only the witch berating her year after year. After 5 centuries of nothingness, and after Giselle loses nearly all memories of Michael and herself, she finally gets a chance to meet another being when Hayden, Miles' grandpa, shows up in the mansion. If door 4 was the start of the true story of the House of Fata Morgana, then door 6 is the end of that introduction. We see the first 3 tales yet again, this time from Giselle's perspective. We see her lose her humanity as the centuries pass. Her hopes crush when she sees Michelle during the 1600s as she doesn't recognize her. Her sanity smashed as she is forced to do gruesome deeds for Yukimasa, and the last bits of her spirit obliterated after watching Jacopo's life go to ruin. Despite all of that, how broken Giselle is all these centuries later, Michael nonetheless reaches out to her and is able to bring her back. Giselle and Michael bickering at each other is insanely cute, with Michael too shy to kiss her, and the courage they show in trying to escape the mansion is inspiring. None of that quite matters though, as the witch once again reappears, taking Giselle and forcing Michael to find her once again. The title card hits once more, except now, rather than a passive observer, we are now meant to play a more active role to discover the full story. While the 6th door is over, this part of the story ain't, as now Michael has to run around the haunted manor and find the 3 keys in order to access the top. Here we get a nice break from all the tales with a bit of an adventure section. Not much of one considering you just hit every choice, but hey, we get to visit our good friend the man in the painting. He's kind of losing it, but he manages to tell us to visit the people in the right order, and that he wants to apologize. He also gives us a clue into the final story of the House of Fata Morgana, that these 3 men are the main sinners responsible for the witch's hatred. Mel's the first one, who's just as meek and weak as before. Eventually, after making himself look even worse by tricking Michael, we get the key from him. Yukimasa's up next, who surprisingly gives us a key without much of a fight, and lastly Jacopo, who unlike the other 2, is quite familiar with Morgana. With all 3 keys in hand, we are able to reach the watchtower once more. Here is where we can finally meet Morgana face to face. Morgana self-proclaims herself to just be human, and is only after reaching the realm of the dead did she ever get any semblance of power, a point she drives home quite hard, as we'll see why in a bit. With that, we dive into the story at the center of it all. As befitting the one at the center of all of these tragedies, Morgana's story is truly the most horrific one of them all. Even by display, it's quite different than the rest, opting for a full text display as opposed to the character CG bottom text we've been used to up until now. Taking place quite a bit before Michael's time, her fate was decided from the beginning as a miracle child, a girl born to a woman who says that she is with child even though she has known no man. Indoctrinated by the insane woman, Morgana grows up believing in her sainthood, and when challenged, decides to give an elderly disease-ridden woman her blood. By some miracle, that woman is healed 3 days later. Driven by this sight, the entire village worships her as Morgana feels like her sainthood has been validated. As for whether she truly has healing powers, the answer is really no, like not at all. These people are just crazy and placebo is a wild thing. Nonetheless, she continues to self-mutilate in order to heal people. Morgana's life quickly takes a darker turn when her greedy mother sells her off after she talks back to her. A lord absolutely mutilates her, taking blood from all of her different body parts as the guests partake for fun. After days of this, the lord then decides to lop off her head because she looks profoundly messed up. Probably because she's been tortured. Also, throughout the recounting of this story, Michael's feeling every bit of pain that Morgana feels, so he's getting absolutely eviscerated here. Anyways, her life is saved due to a slave revolt, and the young man takes her out to the slums, whereupon Morgana finally sees her own appearance, and realizes how monstrous she's become with all of her flesh ripped away from her. At the brothel, a year passes, and just as it looks like her life is finding some semblance of peace, with the woman taking care of her and the young man visiting her, bam! Bandits come in and kill everybody. In the slave carriage, a beastly man breaks free and murders everyone else but her, leaving her free to go. At 12, she stumbles onto a house by the lake where a dead herbalist lays. 4 years later, after taking over the college and position, a young boy visits her seeking remedy for her dying sister. After becoming friends with him, she decides that if anyone deserves her holy blood, it's this nice boy. As you can already imagine, this doesn't go quite well, as a man eventually visits her for miracle blood, which was supposed to be a secret. And although he leaves, he comes back with a young boy who tricks Morgana into letting them in. The beastly man proceeds to lop off her arm and drag her into a watchtower, and she is reunited with the Lord. There, she is forced to be drained of her blood once more, which the Lord sells as medicine. To fully be complicit in their crimes, each of these men hold a key to the watchtower. Each of them wanted her blood for a different reason. For their sister, for the sentence, for money. This draining of blood continues until she perishes, and at the end of it all, she curses all of them as everyone begins to suffer from illness, having ingested her blood. In 1 week, the city is dead. Unfortunately, that isn't quite enough for Morgana, as she curses every single one of these 3 men for all of eternity. Once again, many of the same themes we've been seeing time and time again make their reappearance here. Morgana has insane blind faith towards her mother and purported sainthood that reaches a point in her horrible life where it's the only thing supporting her from exploding. She's pretty much the biggest victim of everyone, of circumstance, of family, and of fate. More importantly than that though, we finally learned about what role every character has to play in the story, why the first 3 protagonists are so hated by Morgana, and how she came into existence in the first place. There is, however, one last character whose past we have not yet seen. Remember the central phase of the story, that these tragedies were easy to bear because they weren't our own, and if it were our secrets revealed, we wouldn't be able to handle it? Because the next story is of course, Michael himself, as Giselle at the top of the tower reveals that Michael isn't exactly a man. If door 5 was the cornerstone of the House of Fata Morgana, then door 7 is the emotional climax of Michael and Giselle's story. Although Morgana's revenge plot is what drags everyone into the mansion in the first place, the main characters of the game are Michael and Giselle, and while we've seen Giselle's side of things, we haven't fully seen Michael's yet. Perspective is very important, and this entire time, we've been viewing every single story up till now with Michael's, which means aside from hearing his thoughts, we haven't been seeing what he doesn't want to show anyone else. Just like with Morgana's story, the display is changed yet again, opting this time for big portraits instead of sprites. For the purpose of how it's written, I'll be calling her Michelle for this section, even though it's supposed to be pronounced Michael. Michelle grew up in a loving family with 2 brothers, Didier and George. One a knight of the church, the other an artist. She was quite a genius, even at a young age, and frequently bemoaned her status as a sickly woman, unable to make use of her talents. Her mother and everyone wanted her to be a nice little girl, but it never felt right. Even men trying to court her just felt inherently wrong. Unfortunately, considering the time period, she wasn't just fighting an uphill battle, it might as well have been a cliff. During this time, she met Amy, George's fiancée, and someone she grew close to. As she drifted further from her brothers due to them not understanding her viewpoint, Amy grew closer. This comes to culmination once Michelle realizes that she likes a woman romantically and tries to confess to her, which turns out awfully. What makes the subsequent conversation interesting, however, isn't that Amy is put off by her homosexuality, rather it is the fact that Michelle feels like the term is wrong inherently. As for why, we'll see that right away. Oh, and on a side note, Amy is cheating on her brother with her other brother, go figure. Anywho, Michelle falls sick and starts to change rapidly. First, her voice becomes manlier, which freaks her mother out and leads her to becoming secluded. Finally, her body changes to a manlier one, which brings Michelle joy. This is why he had always felt like there was something wrong with his life. He was truly a man all along, just one that was trapped in a woman's body, and now he's free. He celebrates this by removing the last 2 letters of his name, making it Michael, pronounced exactly the same. In his fervor, he rushes out to his family having tea to show them his new form. His mother continues to deny him, so in one last attempt, he rips off his clothes, only to be met with horror as Amy calls him a monster. Michael did indeed become a man, that is, a man in every part but down there. This entire incident leads his family to seclude him in a room once more, except this time, he was not coming out, as his mother would go insane the second she saw him. No one wanted to visit him anymore either, as he was considered a devil spawn by this point. No one except for Amy, who conveniently has now found a new toy to play with. Cue up 2 years of mental and physical torture by Amy, who does everything in her power to mess Michael up. Feeding him like an animal, holding him down, you name it. After all that, he is finally taken out by Didier and George, who are sending him out to a deserted mansion. At least until George inherits the estate from their father. As to why they didn't visit him in these 2 years, well, you can probably guess from all the context you've seen up till now. The story from this point takes place back in the mansion, where Michael questions whether he can really believe in his brothers who left him for dead for the past 2 years. During this lonely time at the mansion, he also meets the witch Morgana, who tries to convince him to hate the world as she does. I think right here is where we see Michael's strongest show of strength. Michael is easily at his lowest. He's just been exiled from his family, and has spent the last 2 years being tortured by someone who his 2 brothers believe over him. Although Didier and George made that promise to bring him back, it has been 8 years with no word of what has happened. Having all but been abandoned, he meets Morgana, who promised him an opportunity for revenge, to curse every single one of his family who led him here to death. Despite having all the right in the world, he refuses to curse them, and on the contrary, wishes they could live happily. The only true wish he truly has is that they could accept him for who he is, nothing more. It's not just this one refusal that makes Michael strong, however, it's the fact that for the next 2 years after that, where Morgana spends every waking moment trying to tempt him, he remains steadfast in not giving in, even when his mind and body has all but been decayed. At this time is when Giselle appears, as we get to see their entire cohabitation once more, except this time from his point of view, how Morgana constantly tries to tempt him to get rid of her, and how much their time together truly meant to him. Having found his peace, he bids farewell to the witch, hoping to never call on her again, as their time continues together. In the midst of all that though, Michael still has a very real fear that Giselle would never accept him. No matter how close they got, he could never love her like a normal man would, and he believed that like everyone else, she too would consider him a monster once she knew the truth. With all these hopes and fears in hand, he decides to tell Giselle everything after he hears about George finally taking over the family 11 years later. He pens a letter hoping to hear their thoughts, as he is content despite everything that has been done to him, that he bears no resentment, but wishes that they can accept that he is their son. This doesn't go well, as we cut back to the knights who have come to kill him. Here he makes his first and final wish to Morgana, not to curse his family, but to protect Giselle. In their last moments, Michael wishes Giselle happiness after his death. Perhaps the saddest moment of this entire ordeal is that when the knights finally reach them, we see the scene of him getting stabbed once more, but this time we see it from Michael's point of view, and we realize that the knight who has come to execute him is his brother, Didier. Holy moly, is this moment powerful. George and Didier have both made promises time and time again to protect him, both when she was Michelle and even when he became Michael. He still chose to believe in them despite being left in exile for 11 years. After all that waiting, all that hope he kept despite the odds, he is met with this moment with his brother condemning him to death as a cursed witch. The man he held the greatest respect and adoration for stabbing him to death. And if all that wasn't enough, he is then made to bear witness to his naked corpse crucified, exposing his secrets to the world. Villagers mock his body, stoning him time and time again as everyone stares in disgust. For the final nail in the coffin, after his body has been eaten away by the crows, his mother comes to witness it as she metaphorically spits on his corpse, then literally burns it. In spite of how much hope he held on to, that just maybe he could reconcile with his family despite being the victim of unjust circumstances, that hope has been utterly destroyed. We finally cut to the present, with Michael having been spurned by Giselle after she has discovered the truth of his past. Morgana questions Michael that, having lost everything that he has held dear, his life, his family, his dignity, and even the love of his life, whether he truly does not want to curse anyone, and if he doesn't, then she could give him an out, to reincarnate as a human man and live a normal life free of this mansion. What can I really say here, right? I could try to point out how powerful that despair that Michael faces truly is. I could talk about how incredibly well this story conveys these emotions to the reader. However, I think all of that can already be seen by what I have shown and talked about thus far. So instead, I'd like to continue just a bit further because we have finally come full circle. Maiko, when given the choice to give in, is stopped by Giselle as she reappears in front of Maiko. There she tells Maiko to not listen to what Morgana is showing him and instead to believe in her. I show this in the beginning because I truly consider this the emotional climax of the story, and the reason why I showed it in the intro is because I know that without context, this scene is merely a nice scene between two people who like each other. But once you come in with the perspective of having seen everything up till now, the suffering faced by Giselle and Maiko, just how far his hope of being accepted has been smashed, set on fire, buried underground, only to be dug up and pissed on all over again, that's when every single word of this entire scene hits like a truck. When Giselle reiterates how much she would love him no matter what, with that love lasting hundreds of years, even long after her heart has gone cold, we feel that, having seen what she was forced to do over these long centuries of tragedies. When Maiko says that Giselle had it backwards, that truthfully, he's never once doubted her love, we as a reader believe in Maiko because he has shown time and time again that, despite being put in the worst of situations, he has never once come to despise those who had wronged him. When he talks about how he wanted to be gallant like a man even if it was only in her eyes, you understand why this simple desire means so much to him. When Giselle says the line, "You are the greatest man I've ever known," after seeing all of his past, it's just so damn beautiful. Maiko here embodies every one of the previous protagonists' weaknesses turned into a strength. He is willing to fight to secure his happiness, unlike Mel, who let fear lead him into inaction. He is able to accept everything that makes him Maiko, unlike Yukimasa, who turned away from the truth and turned into a beast. And despite getting hit by all of the horrors of the world, he managed to remain faithful to his own beliefs, rather than blindly trusting in the words of others like Jacopo. So while the story feels like it's over, we still got the final act, as we have to fight the darkness of the house itself, which means saving the one person at the center of all of this, Morgana. While Morgana's story certainly is a horrible tragedy from beginning to end, it is not the whole story, thus we must go back into her past. But this time, seeing the world from not just her perspective, but everyone else's as well. This entire section is pretty fun because it once again changes up the entire game. Instead of tragedies, we are suddenly in a time-traveling detective story. We hop into Morgana's story yet again, except this time we play as Maiko himself. I think the best part of this entire final sequence is the fact that Giselle gets to hang out with Maiko as they work together to save Morgana, even if Giselle is just a ghost that only Maiko can hear. It gives these two a much earned moment to just talk with each other, which feels exceptionally rewarding after the whole emotional moments they just had. Throughout this final chapter, we get to see Maiko run around the town as he attempts to meet and figure out just what each of the three men were thinking as they entrapped the poor girl. It's fun seeing Maiko trying to tiptoe every conversation with all of them, having to throw out some bait so as to catch their attention with his knowledge, but not too much, as 2 out of the 3 are perfectly willing to murder him at a moment's notice. Maiko has always been kind of a sarcastic, grumpy wise-ass, but we haven't really seen much of it on account of all the drama and harrowing tragedies. Here though, it's out in full force, like how he's pretty much constantly bad-mouthing Mel the entire time. When Nelly asks if he's really Mel's friend and Maiko involuntarily responds with, "As much as it pains me to admit," you completely sympathize with the thoughts because wow, Mel is such an idiot. Giselle going, "Why would you say that?" is just another great showing of their back and forth. A major part of this entire finale is Maiko confronting all the different parties involved, as the tragedy of Morgana did not occur because of 3 demons who want to torture her for fun, but rather 3 misguided men who all had different problems that led to this resolution. In order to do so, he first tricks Mel into revealing the truth to Nelly, forcing them to realize that if they keep on lying to each other, trying to show only fake idealized versions of themselves, they would never fix their problems. With Maiko's help, he and Nelly are able to hear why Mel got stuck in this situation, even though Morgana was already willing to give blood for free. And the answer is, Yukimasa threatened him and he was too scared to fight back. While both of them try to pin the blame on Yukimasa, Maiko points out that he made like 0 attempts to save her at any point. Not at his house when he was threatened, not when he tricked Morgana at her house, and not even the next 6 months when he continued working with them to lock her up. There comes a time when you have to act before it really is too late. These words finally help Mel cooperate as Maiko gets his key. When Mel says that Maiko probably had a good home life with family and friends in order to be this caring and proactive, Wow, has he never been so punchable. Up next is Yukimasa, who we get to know by first seeing Pauline the Nun, which doesn't turn out great and only ends with Yukimasa threatening both Michael and Mel. At night though, somehow Michael manages to run to both Maria and Pauline, who both know each other, which finally allows us to break the ice with them. Turns out they grew up in the same orphanage, except Pauline was the favorite child and Maria was not, so she ended up in a brothel. A brothel that got raided 4 years ago. Yep, you guessed it, she took care of Morgana back then. This revelation pisses off Pauline, who refuses to believe them, once again calling the big difference between having faith and having blind faith that refuses to look at the truth. At this point, Michael talks to Giselle about how he and Morgana are really alike, from the road they were forced to take, to the way they suffered, and if only she had someone she could rely upon, which she did, the one young man who helped take care of her in the brothel. This is also the moment where Giselle exits the stage, as what was keeping her tied to Michael has finally run out, so Michael is left to continue the last stretch of the journey alone. Anyways, when Michael wakes up, Yukimasa kidnaps him, and although he tries his best to convince him to help, the man is insane and ruthless, so that doesn't help. What does help is Pauline seeing him break Michael's fingers with the help of Mel, who finally does something useful. Pauline confesses to Yukimasa that she doesn't actually care about the church or being a saint, she was just too scared to try and reach for a different life. Yukimasa, having done all of this on the presumption that it would help her out, completely deflates. As for why he cares about Pauline though, well, we get to see his past in order to understand that. He was a slave, he saw Morgana and wanted to help her out, so he broke free and killed the slavers. Unfortunately, this awakened his bloodlust and he ended up killing all the slaves as well, aside from her. After stumbling away, he became a bandit. 3 years later, he met Pauline on the verge of death, and the normalcy she offers becomes a place of solace for him. She fell in love with him, she became his tether to calm his bloodlust and let him live a normal life. As she becomes more guilt-ridden by this love, she tries to play her role as a saint even harder, which makes her life worse. And that was when Yukimasa was convinced by Lord Jacopo to aid in his plan in order to support the church, thinking that was what she wanted when it was just a role she was playing. This then ends as we already know: chop off Morgana's arm, drag Mel into this problem, bingo bango. Basically, he is indeed a beast, but he is also a tortured man who, despite all the horrors he's committed both in the past and future, is someone who is in pain because he's still trying to be human. In the end, he tries to vow and be as human as possible, if not for his sake, at least for Pauline's. On a side note, considering how mega evil she was in the third door, Maria is really cool in his final door. Although she's the most evil character in the initial 3 doors, here she's the exact opposite. She's a tough as nails lady who is trying to do what she thinks is right, despite the risks, and is probably the only one who had zero involvement in ruining Morgana's life. Michael at this point finally comes to the realization that the Lord who tortured Morgana and the Lord who kidnapped her once again are 2 different people. Not only that, the new Lord Jacopo is actually the young slave man who wanted to make her happy all those years ago, and that is why he holds the biggest connection to Morgana. As for how he went from trying to save her to holding her prisoner and sucking her blood, that's the final story we get to witness. To make a long story short, he really cared about her. 3 years back, he incited a slave revolt, which wasn't too hard as everyone hated the Lord as he was a terrible tyrant. This led to Morgana being free, but unlike the others, she was in a really bad state, so he decided to help her out. This eventually turned into love, as Maria, his good friend, noted. On Morgana's birthday, as he's about to give her his gift, the brothel was raided and Morgana vanished. Soon after, he is told by a maid that he is actually royalty, an unofficial offspring born between the Lord and her. A lie, of course, but at this point he wanted power to prevent the tragedy that took Morgana away from him. This desire to obtain power leads him to living a miserable life, stepping on anyone he could to get higher and higher. And finally, after all that, he hatched his plan to sacrifice an old witch to get him more power. Little did he realize that witch is Morgana herself, and upon seeing him, she immediately began spitting vitriol at him, having mistaken him for the old lord. Jacopo is so lost in his own sauce, however, that he forgot that the whole reason he wanted power in the first place was to protect her, but now he just wanted power for power's sake. Somehow we've gone from Mel, who is kinda dumb, to Bestia, who is even more foolish, to Jacopo, who is the biggest moron of them all. The absolute buffoon decided that he was gonna release her on the day of the festival. You know, not any other time in the last 6 months after he chopped her arm off. With all of that said, it's technically an understandable reasoning that everyone kind of dances around things, using excuses like needing a push. This is just that taken to the extreme. With that, Michael has all 3 keys. When he finally reaches the top and opens that locked door, he finds Morgana talking to herself, acting as both the witch Morgana and Morgana the 16-year-old girl who is grateful to be able to finally die. Realizing she doesn't have long left, Michael comforts her in her final moments, setting her free. After making the 3 men apologize even after her death, they carry her body out of the tower. While it looks like everyone's off to face their sins, the scene cuts to everyone dying, as what has happened this entire time isn't time travel. This is just a reconstruction. No matter what he has done, the past cannot be changed. What has changed, however, is Morgana's viewpoint of what happened. With that, we meet the white-haired girl, her split personality, but also the idealized version of her role as a saintess that she was given from a young age. What comes next is a ton of death realm magical stuff, but basically, the 2 personalities became their own being after death, and both their wish of living and cursing the 3 men for all of eternity melded together, creating not just the house, but also the power of the curse. The white-haired girl would live, but only for the sake of ruining the lives of these 3 men over and over. As for why she looks like how Michael used to be, that's because she thought he was really dang cool and wanted to be like him. She makes a final plea to Michael to erase her, bring her back into Morgana, and ending the curse for good. Having done the deed, Michael comforts Morgana, who is in shambles, having seen what really happened. His true empathy of her situation is what allows her to come to terms with everything. Having realized that this curse only serves to ruin all of their lives, including her own, she and Michael go through the mansion once more as they meet each inhabitant one last time. Mel resolves to, do something instead of waiting. Yukimasa vows to try and keep his beast mode in check, and Jacopo confesses only to be shot down since, well, he royally messed up and everyone knows that. We even get to see George, who was the man in the painting all along. He ended up here just because he wanted to apologize to Michael for his inaction. He never had any animosity, he was just willfully ignorant. It's a fun, stupid moment that brings up the levity after all the heaviness we just went through. And to bring the drama back once again, we have one last man stopping us from freedom. Didier himself ready to burn all the witches. George makes the big sacrifice, giving Michael the courage to call out to Didier once more as he comes to his senses, apologizing for putting the responsibility of their family over him. With that last conflict out of the way, they wander out of the mansion as Morgana and Michael say goodbye. Michael's a little stuck though, as he got stabbed by Didier before to resolve that situation, so all I can do is wait in Soland just as Giselle had waited for him all this time. We got to the epilogue where we see all the main characters living their life in the present, until we reach Giselle, who waits for Michael to come back forevermore. Roll the credits! Ha, psych, just kidding, you gullible idiots, we have a happy ending. The House of Fata Morgana really does an amazing job of introducing a central premise and spinning it in every way possible. Similar to how I tried to show that moment in introduction, then went over it back again once we revisited the emotional climax between Michael and Giselle, this visual novel takes the entirety of Door 4 and peels back layer upon layer in every subsequent chapter. How we first find out how the story truly went in Door 5, how Giselle became the maid in Door 6, and how Door 7 reveals that even Door 5 wasn't the entire truth with Michael's past. Perspective is something that is introduced in the very first story with Mel, front and center with Bestia, and then played around with in every subsequent chapter in different ways. The most amazing part about all of it, however, is the fact that it didn't feel gimmicky. It never felt like how the author manipulates perspective was for the sake of a grand twist, but rather it was used to enhance a story. Michael and Giselle are insanely likable main characters, in a cast of completely misguided morons who completed a stupendous number of wrongs. Both of our main characters stand out in how good-hearted they managed to stay, despite all the crap that was thrown at them. Giselle had to suffer centuries of solitude, becoming a broken husk of a being, and Michael got routinely maimed and massacred throughout the entirety of the story. Look, if you've gotten this far, you already know what I think about this visual novel, so what do you think after hearing everything? Would you have played it knowing what you know now, or if you already did, what were your thoughts on the game? Feel free to leave all of that in the comments. Also, if anyone's interested in seeing me go over any of the game's fan discs, throwed it down there as well. It's got a whole prequel covering the Jacopo and Morgana story in much more detail, which I imagine is gonna be pretty tough to try and make him a likable character after everything we've seen here. There's also a sequel continuing after the epilogue, where we get to see everyone's lives in the present. All supportive stuff, like, subscribe, notifications is in the same place as always if you enjoy listening to me talk for a stupid long time about stories and games. That'll be it for now. I'll see you later next game I cover. Till next time.